Hi everyone, welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Mauro Zappaterra. Mauro obtained his MD and PhD degrees from Harvard Medical School. He completed his PhD doing work with neuronal stem cells and the effects of the cerebrospinal fluid in brain development and in the adult. He has published in numerous scientific articles on the CSF, and his work was chosen as the cover image for the prestigious Neuron Journal. He was also featured in the New England Journal of Medicine in teaching medical students about living with life-threatening diseases, and in Psychology Today on an article titled Joy, the Art of Loving Life. He completed his physical medicine and rehabilitation residency at the VA Greater Los Angeles Healthcare System, where he also served as chief resident. He is board certified in PM&R with a particular focus on optimizing human performance and decreasing suffering. He is the Director of Regenerative Medicine and Clinical Research at Synovation Medical Group and is a staff physician at the VA Greater Los Angeles Healthcare System. As a PM&R physician, he combines his training in various complementary medicine modalities such as polarity therapy, Reiki, and craniosacral therapy, and attempts to treat each individual holistically, integrating body, mind, and spirit. Much of his practice is focused on pain management. He researches and designs new programs and techniques to help alleviate pain, improve function, and increase quality of life. So, hi, Mauro. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much.
So that was a very esteemed bio, and I'm looking forward to talking to you today. I first saw you, or I didn't get a chance to meet you, but I saw you at the Science and Non-Duality Conference in San Jose, California, and I was really blown away by the work that you are doing and have done on the cerebrospinal fluid and the associations with a whole bunch of interesting spiritual ideas that we have in the various traditions. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about that today. But before we get into all of your work, I'd love to hear a little bit about the story of how you got into this kind of research and how the science started to dovetail with the spiritual for you.
Absolutely. So I was at Harvard Medical School, and I was in the MD PhD program, and we have to do various rotations in different laboratories to get a sense of what kind of research we're interested in. I knew that I was always interested in cancer research, and mostly sort of end-of-life care, because cancer, most of the times we think of it being end of life for most people. So trying to heal cancer or treat cancer was sort of one of my goals in entering medical school. I joined or I did these rotations in some cancer labs, and I really felt myself actually becoming more depressed, to be honest with you, as I was doing some of the research. And during that time period, I actually met my wife, who was very interested in complementary and alternative medicines, wanted to actually was considering doing, studying naturopathy, kind of wanted to explore a little bit of what the options were besides just what the Western medical world was teaching us. I was always interested in alternative methods of trying to heal myself. My mother would always give us herbs and vitamins to try to overcome respiratory illnesses and things like that. And at that time, I was actually reading Carolyn Mace's book, Anatomy of the Spirit. And it was talking about energy, essentially how we are made up. Looking at it from a different perspective than anatomy, or how energy gave rise to information that then would become physical form. And at that time, I was actually, I'd undergone a very structured anatomy course at Harvard Medical School, and was still kind of thinking about, what's before the structure? What comes before the structure? Is there something that's actually informing the information that this body is made up? And I was always interested in sort of embryology and how we were developing. And I was in this cancer lab, and I really was not. I was more depressed than anything else. My wife said, "Well, let's take some time off." And she was interested in investigating some healing modalities for herself. And it's actually pretty funny because, I think she went online and she Googled, um, I believe it, I can't remember actually what she Googled, but she came up with polarity therapy.
Hmm.
Like her topic, the topic that she Googled on that day came up with polarity therapy. And she started investigating it and sort of thought this was a perfect opportunity for us to go and study polarity therapy. So we actually I took some time off from doing my MD PhD, and everybody at that time probably thought that I was crazy and that I would never come back, um, which is fine. And we went to New Mexico. We went to Santa Fe and actually studied at the New Mexico Academy of Healing Arts. And we studied polarity therapy. And polarity therapy at that time had two sort of diplomas that you could do. One was an AAP, which was sort of like an associate's program, and then the other one was an RPP, which was a registered polarity practitioner, and you had to do something like 150 hours for the APP and 700 hours for the RPP. And I thought to myself, I'm in med school. I just kind of want to take a little time off and not do anything. And my wife wanted to do this program. She's like, "Come on, sort of nudging me along, like, do this with me, And I'm like, "I'll do the APP with you." And she's like, "Okay, great. I'll have you. For 3 weeks, we'll do this program together, sort of thing." And even in doing the first part of the program, I was still like, you can continue in doing the RPP, and I'll do something else. And I even told her. I remember we were talking about it. I said, maybe I'll be an umpire for softball or something like that, while you go and do your class. And she's like, "No, come on, let's do this together. I feel like we could really." And looking back on it, it's probably been the thing that's changed our lives together the most. We were dating at the time, but had a very serious relationship. And when we talk about it, when we joke about it, we say, if people are going through any hard times, well, what do they need to do? Well, they need to go through an energy medicine course together, right? And sort of, it's like if you don't go through an energy medicine course together, then that's sort of the therapy, because it was very intense. And part of my, let's say, maybe lack of desire to want to do it was maybe some sort of subconscious resistance to the to the potency of what there was underneath some of my emotions and stuff like that. And I was going through a lot of let's say anxiety. I was feeling a lot of tightness in my solar plexus. I was having a very sort of many more, let's say, sympathetically charged moments than parasympathetically charged moments. And going through the course was transformational, essentially, both together. The way that they kind of describe polarity therapy is, when you need to make pure metal, you boil and boil and boil the metal, and all the crap comes up to the top, and you skim that stuff off, and you keep on boiling and boiling and boiling until you have pure metal. Going through an energy medicine course like that is like boiling and boiling and boiling yourself to get to essentially get all the impurities out and get to the pure essence of you. And
can you talk a little bit about what polarity therapy looks like for those that aren't familiar with that discipline?
It's a combination. So it was started by Dr. Randolph Stone, who was an osteopath, and he was also a chiropractor, and he was also a naturopath.
Okay.
He has so many degrees, I say, because he tried one and didn't find it to let's say fulfill his view of health.
Yeah.
And so, he did another thing and hoping that, chiropractics would really be the answer. And that wasn't the answer. And then became an osteopath, and that wasn't really the answer. And so what he started doing is he traveled. He traveled to India. He traveled to China. He traveled to Egypt. And he put all those different healing modalities, whether it was Ayurvedic medicine or Chinese medicine, along with his chiropractic and naturopathic and osteopathic knowledge all together into one sort of comprehensive healing modality. And so it's a combination of of Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, um, some subtle movements. And so it's a combination of hands-on healing that incorporates body movements, diet, and purification, as well as right mind, sort of having the proper intentions, putting your mind in a pure form, let's say, so that's it. And you can either undergo purification techniques with diet and exercise. There's different sort of, let's say, protocols, but as you become more expert in the treatment modality, you sort of do your own thing in a way. And so that was our 700 hours of training of understanding all the various techniques of polarity therapy, as well as all the various, the Ayurvedic diet, some Chinese medicine, how you kind of apply what you feel in palpating the body to a person's diet or a certain movement or an exercise, like some sort of home exercise program that you can give them, stuff like that.
Now, I know that you've also studied craniosacral therapy, and and as a way of sort of segueing into our discussion around cerebrospinal fluid, I wonder, because you hear a lot about this, but you don't really hear like what it is and sort of why it's so necessary. Would you touch on a little bit why what is powerful about craniosacral therapy?
Sure. So part of our polarity teachings were some craniosacral therapy, and what that was it was a biodynamic approach. And there's different sort of schools of craniosacral therapy. The one that we studied was a biodynamic approach, and so what that is essentially it's a very subtle palpation of what's referred to as the breath of life, or the body's inherent life force.
Right.
That there's a certain subtle movements of the tissues, the fluids, the cranium, all the bones, including the cerebrospinal fluid, the central nervous system, all the membranes essentially that surround it, that there's this breath of life that sort of travels through all these tissues. And some describe it as a series of subtle rhythms or pulsations that actually affect our physiological system. And some people sort of describe a cranial rhythmic impulse, or the CRI, which is, if somebody were to have the analogy of an ocean, it would be like the waves that you see on top of the ocean if you're just looking at it from above. And then you get to the mid tide, which is a slower rhythm. That would be like let's say 20 to 100 feet down in the ocean, and then you get to what's called the long tide, or a deep and slow rhythmic impulse. And this is considered sort of the motion of the breath of life. And this is essentially where, in ordering this principle, in ordering the breath of life, by simply, I say simply, it's not, not simple, but by simply palpating the expression of it, and seeing how it's rhythmically being expressed in every individual uniquely, simply being aware of its expression, you're almost providing like a mirror to itself, in that if there are any, let's say, shifts or movements due to trauma or injury, that simply by bringing awareness to that through palpatory skills, you can reignite this self-expression of this fluid motion, this breath of life that essentially informs the body's health, informs all the tissues and fluids, in terms of bringing it back to what is this inherent life force. So that's sort of, let's say, craniosacral is you tap into this this ordering principle, which would be the breath of life through the palpation of people using your hands,
Yeah.
and seeing how this breath of life is expressed. Is it fully expressing itself? Is it expanding and contracting, almost as if an ocean would be in its in its perfect expansion and contraction of the tides, for instance?
Yeah.
And then essentially your treatment plan is simply becoming aware of any areas that might not be expanding and contracting, and even just suggesting it a regular breath of life, a regular inherent expansion and contraction with your palpation.
Wow, that's a really beautiful description of that. It makes me want to go get a craniosacral therapy session immediately.
It's pretty powerful. We sort of, in the class, we're sort of, some people say, use your hands, pretend like your hands have 1,000 mirrors on them. That's and every single movement and every single energy, reflect it back onto itself, so that the energy just recognizes itself. And you're not making any part of it is, the classes that we went to sort of taught, center, ground, neutral. So even if you do feel that there might be some constriction, there's no judgment about it. There's no assess. It's simply a reflection of that energy back onto itself, so that by seeing itself, it may actually choose to change if it's ready to do so.
Right.
By simply listening through the hands.
Beautiful. So yes, go.
That one connection. So it was actually it was Jeffrey Wilson, who was during our polarity class, who said, the CSF is one molecule away from seawater.
Right.
And I sort of looked at him. I'm like, there's no way that the CSF is one molecule away from seawater, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that was, all that kind of put together was the initial spark. So the many discussions with my wife, going through polarity, having part of this craniosacral be in our polarity class, was the initial spark to actually, when I went back, I said, I want to study brain development, and I want to study the cerebrospinal fluid, essentially.
Yeah.
And I found a lab in Harvard that would support me, in what I was looking to do. And then we decided, while I was getting my PhD, both my wife and I decided to do then another 750-hour training course in just biodynamic craniosacral therapy. And so that's what now my wife does on a full-time basis, essentially working with children who have any developmental issues whatsoever, but working with children to help them in terms of whether it's developmental, perceptual, neurological, even through birth, cranial compression, things like that, to help them resolve any issues.
So most of your work now, is really highlighting this fascinating fluid that we've all, up until now perhaps taken for granted, which you've already mentioned, the cerebrospinal fluid. So what initially triggered your curiosity about this fluid? I mean, you said, you mentioned that it's one molecule away from seawater. What's the implication of that? Like what, obviously it's fascinating, but what could that even mean?
I had no idea. I had no idea, but it was kind of like one of those things that I had to follow.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And the experiences I had with craniosacral therapy, not only on myself, having practitioners work on me, but also palpating these subtle fluctuations, I was like, wow, we can really feel the pulsations. Like we can really feel them. And I had some powerful experiences myself. And, after you've had an experience, there's no way to discredit your own experience. It's not like, oh, that didn't really occur.
You
you
remember
know,
it. Yeah, you
that
recall it.
occurred, you
Yeah.
know. Um, and 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 so it was just something that had to be followed. And
Yeah.
embryologically, so I was having these powerful experiences therapeutically, let's say, and then I was also looking at it from a developmental, it was sort of this unique thing where, I was getting cranial sessions and I was also looking at the embryology of how we were developing simultaneously. And this person, Jeffrey's words were in my head of, CSF is like the ocean, it's one molecule away from the ocean. And I was looking at these embryological pictures of human development. And what I saw, and if you see some of my slides, what I saw was an early embryo, human embryo, and the brain, the part that became the brain, was like, let's say half a centimeter big, um, thick in the middle, and it was on the outside, and it kind of looked like a heart. It's almost like if you were drawing it, it'd be the outer, the outer edge of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
In the middle, in the center of the heart, was emptiness. In the center of the emptiness was this cauliflower-like structure that was almost like an island.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have this sort of island in the middle, and then this very sort of thin heart-shaped structure on the outside. That was going to become the brain. And I look in that and I said, what's all the space?
Mm-hmm.
And what's in the middle? And my colleague said, well, that's the choroid plexus. I said, that's the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus took up, more volume, more space at that time in development than almost like the entire brain did. It was huge. It was ginormous. And the space, which to me looked like emptiness at that point, I recognized was actually filled with fluid. That was all cerebrospinal fluid that was bathing the brain that was created by the choroid plexus. And I said, man, when we grow cells in lab, they always have to be grown in fluid. It's almost every single laboratory in the world is growing cells in fluid right now. People have to show up on weekends to change the fluid. Do they have the right growth factors? Do they have the right pH, salts, sugars? And I said, where's the brain getting its fluid? That's it. The brain is growing in the cerebrospinal fluid. It is, it's almost as if the brain is the shore, and the fluid is this entire ocean that's bathing it consistently, providing it with growth factors and nutrients and, proper salts so that it can be, so that the cells don't burst and things like that. And I said, that's amazing. That's the endogenous growth media that we use in the lab to grow tissues. So I looked in the literature and I said, what's known about this fluid? Because it was really very little actually at that point. There was maybe, there were a couple of reports looking at the fluid, and nobody had ever done, tried to do a study of what was actually a very comprehensive study with high tech mass spectrometry of what's actually in the fluid. And so, the first question was essentially, what's in this fluid that's bathing our brain? And that, as I went on, earlier and earlier and earlier in development, I realized that this fluid was actually the amniotic fluid. So when you're a tiny, tiny, tiny 3-layered organism, not even when you're 3 cell layers thick, you have amniotic fluid on one side and the yolk sac on the other side. And that amniotic fluid is in your mother. It's in the mother's womb. You are being bathed by that fluid in your mother's womb. And just to think of that, like that the amniotic fluid is sort of like that one of the initial fluids that is actually bathing us. And then that amniotic fluid becomes then the cerebrospinal fluid through a series of differentiations. And so you're bathed in your mother, going back embryologically. You're in the big mother of the earth. You're in your mother, your mom. You're in your embryo, which has a sac within a sac, which is filled with chorionic fluid. Inside of that, there's a 3-layered sheet with amniotic fluid on one side and yolk sac fluid on the other side. And so you're essentially completely bathed in fluid for a huge majority of your embryologic development. All the cells that give rise to every single cell in your body right now was actually bathed in amniotic fluid, or some sort of fluid. And when we realize that, we're like, wow, this fluid is bathing all the progenitor cells, all the neural stem cells of our entire central nervous system. And what happens is that the amniotic fluid slowly differentiates into the cerebrospinal fluid as the process of development occurs. And then there becomes a separation between the cerebrospinal fluid being inside the brain and inside the central nervous system, and then the amniotic fluid still bathing the outside of your entire being. You're essentially floating in amniotic fluid throughout the 9 months of gestation.
Yeah. So now, how do we transition now into the anatomy around, I'll call it just the anatomy of IM, which is sort of where we're going eventually when we start to sort of discuss this cerebrospinal fluid in a kind of spiritual way. And in a number of your talks, you refer to the glands and the ventricles.
Yep,
I don't know the
perfect.
vocabulary very well. Ventricles and glands in the brain. And so do you want to just unpack that for us so we can start to move into this discussion of
Sure.
what dovetails with the spiritual traditions?
Sure. So to me, the I am is, the way that I've defined it for myself is sort of that inner sense of beingness, sort of your inner perception of existence. That when, for me, it's my experience. When I tap into that, it's a global experience. Okay. It's there. It's present. There's no sort of defining it or negating it for any. And so what happened is that essentially, I started sort of focusing on the cerebrospinal fluid and just focusing on my own cerebrospinal fluid. And what I noticed is that anatomically, when you look at the ventricles of the brain, the third ventricle is right in the middle of your brain, right? Essentially, if you were to draw a line from your ears, the top of your ears in, and if you sort of go from your third eye or brow center directly in, that's your third ventricle. And it's a perfectly midline structure, right? In front of it, okay, so in front, if you're sort of going towards your eyes, is your pituitary gland. Going back is your pineal gland. So both these glands are actually making contact with the third ventricle. On the sides, you have your thalamus and hypothalamus. All these are just anatomically very important brain centers. Okay. Going down from there, or let's say going up from there, then you have your lateral ventricles, and the lateral ventricles occupy the sort of in the two hemispheres of your brain. The ventricles make contact with every single lobe of your brain. So they make contact with your frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe. Okay. The occipital lobe even sends out a little projection. If you were to look a picture of this, it actually even sends out a projection so that it actually goes all the way back to our visual centers. Looking at that, you sort of look at that and say, if there's fluid in the brain that just sort of provides, let's say, nutrients to the brain, or, a buffer, why would it anatomically, why would it have this sort of very unique structure? Some people have sort of described it as a butterfly or a bird flying, as the beak is the third ventricle, the body is the third ventricle, and then the two wings on the outside of the lateral ventricles. It also goes through, it goes all the way down the center of your spinal cord. All right. So so you have a spinal cord. Inside the spinal cord, there's a hollow canal. That hollow canal is filled with cerebrospinal fluid going all the way down. Outside of your spinal cord and surrounding your entire brain is all cerebrospinal fluid. So essentially, not only on the inside of your brain, but also on the outside of your brain, down your spinal cord, all the way to the sacrum, all the way down to the sacrum, which would be about S1 or S2 anatomically. And then there's the sacral, there's a sacral sac. When people have looked at, for instance, what does the cerebrospinal fluid do? Just in general, it provides a lot of survival factors, growth factors to both the embryonic and the adult brain. It provides important information for neural stem cells to survive, for instance. It provides nutrients. It provides buoyancy for the brain. And now, actually, interestingly, this cerebrospinal fluid may have a role in the lymphatic system in terms of helping to clear the brain of its toxins while we are sleeping. That the cerebrospinal fluid may almost provide like a flush of the brain of its toxins while we are sleeping and transition all that stuff to the lymph nodes. They call it the lymphatic system. And that's one of the first sort of discoveries of why sleep is important for us. That the cerebrospinal fluid sort of comes in and cleans out the brain. And so it has a lot of important physiological functions. But then there's a question of, well, is that all it does? Going back to my studies of polarity therapy and craniosacral therapy, Dr. Stone stated the soul swims in the CSF.
I love that image.
He stated, the cerebrospinal fluid seems to act as a storage field and a conveyor for the ultrasonic and light energies. And you just have to think of that, was he just saying that? Like, people don't just say things like that. Dr. Sutherland, who is one of the founders of cranial osteopathy from an osteopathic perspective, he said that his teacher, Dr. Still, envisioned the cerebrospinal fluid as an intermediary in the movement of divine intelligence.
Wow.
Okay, right? That's pretty interesting. A channeling of creation into embryological segments and irrigating them with life, giving form and function and order and intelligence to our existence. Wow. So when I looked at that, I was like, wow, this is my experience from a palpatory. When I'm doing, I definitely feel like, okay, there's an ordering principle here at play. Is it the cerebrospinal fluid or is it something else? Okay. From the craniosacral teachings, from my own meditations, essentially, what I started doing is essentially started going into my third ventricle, into the fluid-filled space of the third ventricle. And from that, what I recognized is the walls of the brain have receptors on them. Those receptors can transmit light. They can transmit movement or vibrations. They can transmit growth factors or hormones. And because it's fluid, if something happens to the fluid, instantaneously, that information can get to every single major control center of the brain in a flash. It's like an instant messenger. Okay? It doesn't have to go through the cell walls. It doesn't have to be transmitted via synapses. It's sort of like, hey, I want to tell my whole body something simultaneously. What's the first mechanism for it to do? Give some information to the cerebrospinal fluid, allow that to be dispersed instantaneously throughout my entire central nervous system, have my entire central nervous system pick that up, and That's could be a holistic experience with total synchronization of all your nervous system, your entire nervous system at once, based on the pure fluid properties of the fluid itself and where it's located.
So, are we talking about something kind of like the classic mystical experience here, or
Anything.
anything?
Yep. Whether it's a drug or your classic mystical experience.
Right.
People are trying to get drugs to the brain, to different areas of the brain, to for brain injury or for stroke, and they're trying to get it. They're trying to get into the cerebrospinal fluid, so it disperses to the brains.
Yeah.
Or a mystical experience, and the majority of people have essentially contacted me in terms of, when I describe the anatomy of this fluid-filled space going all the way down to their sacrum, and how Yogananda and Vivekananda have described sort of anatomically very similar things that, they say, well, this is how the energy flows. And what I'm showing is this is actually where the cerebrospinal fluid is. And for people to feel like there's actually a fluid movement, some sort of fluid moving in their spinal cord all the way up, bathing the back of their head, going into the center of their head, and then sort of expanding outward. A simultaneous, aha moment where everything they sort of felt it simultaneously, and it almost felt like a drop of whatever it was, cosmic consciousness was dropped into the cerebrospinal fluid, some sort of energetic ultrasonic light of some sort, was dropped into the cerebrospinal fluid, and it was dispersed instantaneously. Boom. And the experience was total holistic, total synchronization of the entire body, essentially, through the experience of what the message was being transmitted via the cerebrospinal fluid, essentially.
So when you're describing sort of the cerebrospinal fluid extending all the way down to the sacrum, it of course, for anybody that's familiar with the Kundalini kind of map of the subtle body, it sort of it makes us think, okay, well, is this cerebrospinal fluid which is bathing the spine? Is this what's sort of facilitating, or is this the vehicle for that classical idea of the awakened Kundalini rising up the Sushumna towards the Sahasrara, or whatever, the third eye? And so is that essentially this, because I know you've talked about this a little bit, and so I guess I want to hear you talk a little bit also about the in the gland. In one of the talks I listened to, you mentioned the pituitary gland and the pineal gland, and then the third ventricle. There's a sense in this kind of classic Kundalini awakening experience, there's a fusion or a connection. I mean, how?
Yes.
What's happening there? Like, what is physiologically taking place? And this, I suppose, is speculation to some extent, but what could be taking place in that moment where it pierces Brahma's door or pierces the third eye? That experience of the Kundalini rising.
Yeah. So so everything you said essentially is right on. A couple things. One is, and then don't let me forget the Kachari Mudra before we leave, because that was another thing that was sort of too fascinating for me. Yeah. Could the cerebrospinal fluid be the vehicle for the Kundalini rising, essentially? Because the Sushumna is a fluid-filled channel. Or it's a channel. It's in the middle. It's in the center of the spinal cord. It's filled with fluid, and it goes all the way to the third ventricle. Some people, the cerebrospinal fluid goes all the way down as well to the sacrum. So if there's some sort of movement within the cerebrospinal fluid that could easily provide the cerebrospinal fluid could easily be the vehicle for this movement of the Kundalini up, through the sacrum, up the spinal cord, into the third ventricle, perfectly situated there. Now, there's a very interesting quote from Swami Vivekananda, sort of talking about the Sushumna, Pingala, and Ida, which are the two major other nerve currents in the spinal column. And when he mentions those are, when you look up sort of the three nadi, nadi means in Tamil means nerve or blood vessel or pulse. In Sanskrit, it can mean channel or stream or flow. Typically, Ida lies to the left and is seen as, let's say, the feminine. Pingala lies to the right. Some have them intertwining the Sushumna, each chakra. Some have them just staying on the right and the left side. And then there's a meeting. There's a meeting of these in the third eye, the ajna. The Sushumna runs along the center, Ida on the left, Pingala on the right, sometimes intercrossing at all the chakras, and then meeting at the third eye. Now, what is the third eye? Could the third eye, the ajna chakra, could it actually be the meeting of the Ida, which is the feminine, the pineal gland, and the pituitary gland, Pingala, the sort of the masculine, the meeting of the two energies with the Sushumna coming up the middle as the central canal into the third ventricle. Okay, so if you have the two polarities of the yin and the yang, the yin, the reason why I say yin pineal gland is because the pineal gland, its function, we see it as being activated mostly, let's say, at night. So you kind of think of like the feminine, sleep, the feminine coming out at night, where the pituitary gland is more helps regulate, the pituitary hypothalamic adrenal axis, which is sort of like, the get up and go sort of thing. Yeah. And so that's why some people have actually said, sort of the feminine and the masculine, but in the middle of that, there needs to be a balance. Yeah. So if you have too much masculine and not enough feminine, you don't have a very good balance. When you have that perfect balance of the yin and the yang, then you have unity. You have the unity of the yin and the yang. In the middle is the cerebrospinal fluid. Mm-hmm. In the middle, what allows there, let's say the medium, which there can be this transmission of between the pineal and the pituitary, is the third ventricle, is that Sushumna coming up where they all meet in the third ventricle. And we know that there are molecules that are released from both these glands that go into the cerebrospinal fluid. If you have too much of the pineal gland, let's say, being released, you might actually have too much melatonin. It might actually be hard for you to wake up. You want the balance, right?
Day.
You kind of want, yes. You want the balance. You want that you want the pineal to kind of go out, to stop secreting the melatonin at around 5 o'clock, so that the adrenal glands and the pituitary glands can start to arise and sort of, and take over.
5 o'clock, Mauro. We're talking more like 9:10.
Hey, and so essentially, there are some traditions who consider, this space between those glands. I've heard them referred to as the Crystal Palace, the Cave of Brahma. And those things, anytime somebody refers to them as that, in my own personal experience, that's sort of exactly where it is. It's this, let's say it's this crystalline lake where, intentionally you could actually activate the pituitary gland. You can activate the pineal gland. You can cause a little bit of imbalance if you wanted to. um, it's really about bringing the polarities, the balancing of the polarities, the yin and the yang to be perfectly balanced so that one is working with the other in perfect harmony and unison and creating a, sort of a balanced energy system.
Yeah.
When that occurs, then it's sort of my belief that when you have that perfect polarity balance between those, that with the Sushumna and the yin and the yang, balancing them all out, that's actually when some people may have that experience of their total existence, essentially. Mm-hmm. And they totally experience their own beingness perfectly. In essence.
So that's sort of the non-dual state that a lot of traditions are referencing.
Yes.
So now, what is the role? You had mentioned the Khechari Mudra. So what is the role of that old yogic practice on all of this?
Well, the interesting part is that when you look at the anatomy of the mudra, what it is essentially it's the tongue that's rolled up and touches first it touches the hard palate, and then with practice you get up to touching the soft palate, and it's inserted in essence into the nasal cavity behind the palate, and it may take months or years to practice, but once you're actually inside the nasal cavity, what the tongue does is it stimulates the top of the nasal cavity. The top of that nasal cavity, interestingly, is where the olfactory bulbs are located. That's where your sense of smell and right. Those are the neurons that come from the brain that give you the sense of smell. That's one area where we actually have access to the cerebrospinal fluid. In fact, people have tried to, and they are doing so, using intranasal, sprays, intranasal inhalers to try to deliver growth hormones to the cerebrospinal fluid via the intranasal passages directly through the olfactory bulb, through the cerebrospinal fluid. It's sort of like that's one area where the blood-brain barrier is not as fixed. And so if you're stimulating that area, the goal of that, one of sort of the repercussions is that a liquid emanates from the roof of that cavity, and that liquid is the amrit, or the nectar. Amrit stands for immortal, or sort of if you taste that nectar, you are bestowed immortality. People who have practiced it have said that once they get the experience of the nectar through the practice, that there's an expansion of consciousness. Mm-hmm. The question is the nectar, is that amrit that everybody has been discussing, is that actually cerebrospinal fluid? Mm-hmm. That's the nectar. It would be a perfect, there's a sweetness to the cerebrospinal fluid because it has, sugars in it. It's accessible to that area of the, let's say, brain or head. And, I'm just going to leave it at that. Is that the amrit that mudra is attempting to get a taste of? Of course, it's the whole mudra. It's not just, you can't just take cerebrospinal fluid and drink it, let's say. So that would be, that's just, that's another sort of open-ended question,
Yeah.
of, is that the actual, is that cerebrospinal fluid that they were talking about with the umrith? And to me, it makes perfect sense from an anatomical perspective.
Yeah, it does make sense, and it's really fascinating. And so I guess my last question, which and I think it's so easy for people to kind of write off, people that haven't had the experience to write off sort of the the way that this anatomy and this experience is sort of articulated because people think it doesn't have a sort of physiological counterpart. And I think that what you are offering really is exactly that. It's really an explanation that makes total sense given the nature of the cerebrospinal fluid and where it exists and its fluid nature and all of this. So it's really fascinating. Is there, besides, this speculation around the cerebrospinal fluid as the amrita, as the nectar of immortality, is there anything else speculative that we can sort of say based on all of this science that you've been working on?
I mean, speculative. There's, as more research comes out, there's more research that it's becoming to be a more important fluid than what we previously thought. So as more and more research is actually being done, the difficult part on this is that it's research done. It's hard to do things. It's hard to do research. And sometimes, unfortunately, there are animals involved and things like that. And so, we tread that lightly in terms of respecting any animal that needs to be used for research. But the research, medical research has significantly helped a huge number of people. And, so the research continues as the research is continuing, more and more information is coming out in terms of the powers of the cerebrospinal fluid, including what it's doing while you're sleeping. My next, let's say, speculation is that's not only while it's sleeping, but actually in also deep states of meditation, for instance.
Right.
That we can actually alter our brain physiology and our brain chemistry, and even the junctions that we thought were so tight that prevented fluid from going from one space to another. That in deep states of meditation, for instance, just like in sleep, those junctions separate. They open up a little bit more, and that fluid can actually flow more into the brain parenchyma, into the brain tissue itself. Beautiful. And what they're seeing is, as you sleep, it cleans things. It actually cleans toxins out. In deep states of meditation, or in deep states of craniosacral practice, or in deep states of yogic practice, I do feel as if the brain is actually undergoing an anatomical change in the way that the molecules are connected to allow more space for this fluid to actually bathe the parenchyma, bathe the actual, bathe the entire brain, go through the entire brain. And so I think that's where it's going. What I'm trying to develop now is I've sort of left the lab, so I don't do any more. I myself don't do any more animal research. The postdoc that I worked with, Maria Lettinen, she continues to do research, but I don't do. I'm mostly working right now with humans, and essentially in creating, not only meditations, but different ways of trying to activate, let's say, the pineal gland. Are there ways of intentionalizing, or doing meditations where you're activating your pineal gland? And one of the things we didn't talk about is DMT, but it's speculated that actually DMT may be produced in the pineal gland as well. And that's been coined the spirit molecule by Rick Strassman. And it's used commonly in shamanic rituals. And if there's some people who have more access to, let's say, DMT, people who have used it have had, profound mystical experiences. Um, and are there some people who have more or less access to that controlled? Because there's also some studies that have looked at DMT endogenous, and you stated that sort of schizophrenics have more of it than others. And I say, well, what are we looking at that quote unquote disease appropriately then?
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
Yeah,
what is it that, have we talked to them in the language that they're using to communicate,
exactly. Yeah.
in terms of, what is it that if they do have, then what is that, and that might be, and let's say that's the cause of some of their hallucinations. What are they understanding from that? Instead of just, institutionalizing people like that, and sort of, and sort of shunning them out.
Yeah.
Actually learning from that and seeing, is there a way that we can actually learn more about what this molecule is doing, and in people maybe who do have more of it, what is it causing? Because again, it's a polarity, it's a balance, right? You can't have too much of melatonin, even too much of, let's say even chocolate, is
No, no, Mauro.
I said it. No, but so I'm sort of transitioning to the human, and trying to see, are there any ways of tapping into this, and trying to, for instance, decrease people's pain. I have a lot of people who contacted me who said, I had a CSF leak. And a CSF leak is essentially when you've had a procedure done, and it can happen from an epidural from giving birth. It can happen from, if you're in pain and you've had an epidural. It can even happen from, I had a person contact me who it happened from a chiropractic manipulation.
Yeah.
And it's a tear in the lining that contains that holds the CSF close to the spine, and it's a tear, and so now there's a leak, and it needs to be fixed somehow. And they said, as soon as I had the leak, I forgot who I was. The sense of, like when you talk about the the sense of I am just completely disappeared.
Yeah.
And I tried to do this, I tried to do that, I couldn't do it. It was almost as if there was an open tap that was slowly removing that sense of me being from me. And it was many years of, I tried every therapy, blah, blah, blah. And ultimately some people have healed, but their stories are remarkable. And so I'm putting these stories together as another way of, I go on to the CSF Leak Foundation, and nobody's talking about those types of experiences. It's all about kind of my headaches or, things like that. And so, are there other experiences that people are having that as they hear, maybe more of the functions of what the CSF is doing, that they, or potential that they're connecting it with their own personal experience? And like I said, it's hard to invalidate somebody's personal experience. It's really, once it becomes yours, it's very difficult to say, that didn't really happen. You're like, well, so that's kind of the work that I'm doing now, and so that's where we are.
That's excellent. I mean, it's really fascinating work, and I look forward to, hearing more about what you're doing and seeing the research that you put out based on all of this work with humans that you're doing now. So, do you want to share a little bit about, where you're at for anybody that wants to connect with you, or?
Yeah. I mean, I'm always open. I love hearing people's direct experience of anything. Especially if you go onto YouTube and you listen to any of my talks or anything like that, and I'll be creating more CSF meditations and stuff for people, and I'll put those on YouTube as well. I'm in Pasadena, California. My email address is my first and last name at gmail.com, so people can email me with their direct experience of anything involving the cerebrospinal fluid. I get emails almost daily of people who have had people who either the videos have validated something in them, or like you said, it helped ground some esoteric information that they had.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I feel like part of my bridging of polarity craniosacral Western medicine is. It's allowing to it's trying to ground the esoteric information and the esoteric experiences that people are having, that many people are just frou-frouing as new age, just BS in a way. And it's really too bad, because as we learn more and more about the human body, it's like, well, the human body is an amazing, it's an amazing miracle. But for anybody to frou-frou anybody's experience is just, to me, it's just disrespectful. And it's almost like, well, maybe we don't know that yet. Somebody would have said, oh, you have a bone inside your muscle. Well, let's take an X-ray of it. Yeah. There's no way to take an X-ray of a bone. Well, now we have an MRI, and now now there's even something that's looking at I want to call it electromyo. I'm not going to say it right, but I think it's EM instead of MRI, it's ERI or something like that, where they're actually looking at brain connections by taking a scan of the energy of the brain, 2 or 3 feet away from the brain, in terms of understanding neural connections. So, I'm trying. So my goal is sort of to bring a little bit of groundedness to some of the let's say experiences or explanations, and I've been surprised, because a lot of people have said, wow, it actually validates what my experience, and it's like, wow, that's really interesting that sort of an anatomic physiologic talk would validate somebody's esoteric experience, but it really doesn't. It actually helps them quite a lot. So
yeah, absolutely.
So I'm always interested in sort of people's direct experience. If you do any of the meditations, on the cerebrospinal fluid, if you have any experience of, wow, like that was really different than any other meditation I've done, that I'd love to hear people's experience, essentially.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I think that parallelism between the esoteric and the physiological is important, and the more aligned they can be, the more sense it makes for people. So, thank you for doing this work, and it's been a real pleasure chatting with you, Mauro. So I thank you once again.
Thank you very much. It was great.